Hi everyone, Nicole Wood here with Scicomm Monday, back at the poster session here at AGLR 2017. We're in the middle of the poster session, so I apologize for all the background noise. We'll try to talk as loud as we possibly can to make sure that you all can hear us. If you have any questions about Ellen's research that we're going to be talking about here shortly, definitely feel free to send those in via the chat. If there are other questions that you have, if you're catching this on replay afterwards, feel free to tweet Ellen at her Great Lakes Cisco Twitter account. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ellen George from Cornell University, and she's going to talk to us about the genetic limitations to Cisco restoration in Lake Ontario. I had to make sure I read it off.
Hey, hi everyone. My name is Ellen George, and I am a PhD student at Cornell University, and I study Cisco in Lake Ontario. For those of you that don't know what Cisco is, or think it's just the truck that brings food to restaurants or communication software or anything, Cisco are actually a fish. They are also called lake herring, and they're called lake herring because they're very similar to herring in that they fill a similar ecological niche. They are a long silvery fish that schools, and a lot of things eat them. So, and they're oily, so that's why people sometimes call them lake herring. But they're actually not related to herring. They're actually related to salmon. So, just like salmon, they have an adipose fin, which is that extra little fatty fin right near the tail fin. So that's how you know if you've gotten a Cisco and not an alewife or rainbow smelt or another type of little silvery fish that's found in the Great Lakes. They used to be one of the largest fisheries in the Great Lakes. Until they collapsed in the late 1800s, early 1900s across the Great Lakes. So not that many people fish for them now, at least not down here in the lower lakes in Lake Ontario, although there is still a commercial fishery up in Lake Superior. So there's a little bit of an interest in bringing Cisco back to Lake Ontario for commercial and recreational species, but the big reason we want them back is because of their role in the food web. So they're a really important native crayfish species for salmon and lake trout. And the reason they're important is because they're very low in thiaminase. And thiaminase is an enzyme that breaks down vitamin B1 or thiamine in the bodies of salmon and trout or whatever is eating crayfish in the lake. And if a fish eats a lot of thiaminase and gets really low in vitamin B1, then it leads to reproductive failure. So some of the invasive species that we have in the Great Lakes, like alewife and rainbow smelt, are really dominating the crayfish biomass right now. So like over 90% of the crayfish in Lake Ontario are invasive alewife and rainbow smelt. And that means that that's not a really good buffet for these lake trout and salmon. So we're trying to bring native crayfish species like Cisco back to try to give these lake trout and salmon something healthier to eat. The specific population that I'm studying is in Chameau Bay, New York. Chameau Bay is up near Watertown, and Chameau Bay contains the last known remaining spawning population of Cisco on the American side of Lake Ontario, so it's really important. There's also a population that may be possibly spawning in the Bay of Quinte on the Canadian side, but we aren't completely sure about that because we don't have like eggs on rocks yet. Once we get eggs on rocks, we'll know for sure. But we have eggs on rocks in Chameau Bay, so we know they're spawning there. And now that we know they're spawning there, we have all these questions about the genetics of the population. The fish that we're getting out of Chameau Bay are currently being used as brood stock for a stocking program at USGS Tunison. And it's really important to know what the genetic diversity is of fish you're going to use as brood stock, because if they're really inbred and they have very low genetic diversity, then they might not be a really great source of fish to be pumping back into the lake. We don't want to be putting a lot of inbred fish back in the lake. So my project has three different parts. The first part is looking at how genetically diverse the Chameau Bay Cisco population is. Should we be using these as brood stock for this stocking effort? The fact that they were so severely overfished means that they might have gone through what's called a genetic bottleneck, where you used to have a lot of genetic diversity, and then the fish were so overfished that it went down to so few individuals that you get a bottleneck in the genetic diversity and you have very, very small genetic diversity. So we actually just got results back on that this last week, And the measure that we use to look at diversity is called allelic richness, which is the number of alleles, average number of alleles over different loci. And it looks like our allelic richness for Cisco in Chemot Bay is about 12. So 12 alleles per loci, which is actually very similar to lake whitefish. And lake whitefish are a much higher population level in Chemot Bay, so they're kind of our standard for what a healthier population would look like. So the fact that they have very similar levels of diversity is good news. It means there may not be bottleneck effects that are really limiting the diversity of Cisco. The second project that I'm working on is looking at how many spawning stocks there may be in Lake Ontario. So we know they're at least spawning in Chemot Bay. They're probably spawning in the Bay of Quinte. But we don't know if that's actually the same population or if they're two separate populations. So we're going to use microsatellites to look at the diversity of Chemot Bay and compare it to the Bay of Quinte and see if they are genetically different or if they are genetically the same. And if they're the same, it may mean that they're just a big mixed stock and they're not actually always returning to the same place to spawn, or they might be, like kind of moving in and out of the system. We're also, as part of this project, looking at some of the historical spawning locations. So Cisco used to spawn all up and down the eastern basin of New York, but now we only know about that Chemot population. So part of this project is looking at spawning time around different embayments that used to be big Cisco spawning locations and seeing if we find any spawners returning. And maybe we might find like a few remnant stocks that might have slipped under the radar over the last couple decades. So that part of that project is going on right now. We found a couple fish, 3 in Irondequoit Bay last fall, 1 in Sandy Pond, which is really exciting. It's also possible that it was one little male. He may just have been lost. So I felt really bad for him because it was like, good job, dude, but all your friends are up north. So he may have been lost, but he also may have represented maybe a new spawning population that's branching off. So we'll have to see how that evolves, but through time. But if we get more fish, we can compare them to the Chemot Bay population and see if they're genetically different or the same. So the last project that we're working on is looking at whether or not Cisco are hybridizing with lake whitefish in Chemot Bay. So lake whitefish are very closely related to Cisco. They're in the same genus, and they can successfully hybridize. In the Bay of Quinte, the commercial fishermen call them mule Cisco. So just like a mule horse, which is a cross between a donkey and a horse, these mules kind of look about halfway in between a Cisco and a whitefish, and they're sterile. So if they are hybridizing, and especially if they're hybridizing at a really high rate, those fish are kind of a genetic dead end for our Cisco population. And we kind of got worried about that because 2 years ago we had a really late fall and then a really quick freeze up. And usually the whitefish and the Cisco spawn about a week or two apart. But that year, because the freeze up was so quick, they actually overlapped. And we had Cisco and whitefish eggs on the same egg mat at the same time, which means they were probably spawning in the same location. And because they can hybridize, that got us a little worried about the fact that they may be hybridizing at a high rate in Chemot Bay. So for that, we're actually going to be using a different genetic method. For the two first projects I talked about, we're using microsatellites. But for this project, we're going to be using SNP markers. And we'll be using RNA transcriptome to develop a SNP panel that will be able to distinguish between purebreds and hybrids. So it's a little bit more of a high-tech, more data-intensive process. And that way, if there are hybrids, we can tell how many there are and maybe calculate like what percentage of the population are hybrids. And if it's a really high percentage, then that may be a warning sign for the Cisco the genetics of the Cisco population. So that is an overview of my 3 projects. A lot of work, a lot of Cisco stuff going on. And I'd love to take any questions you guys have. And I also want to point out, just like we mentioned in the beginning, I am at Great Lakes Cisco. So feel free to tweet me either now or afterwards with any Cisco questions that you have. Any questions from you?
I have a question. So
Yeah.
you said that they're a prey species. Do people actually eat them?
Yes.
Like, is it like a consumptive fish?
Yes. Actually, cisco are delicious. There is still a commercial fishery for them up in Lake Superior, and they're very good. A lot of times they're smoked. They make delicious smoked fish. If you've ever had smoked whitefish, they're very similar, although in my opinion they're even tastier. They have a higher fat content than whitefish, so they really soak up that smoky flavor. They're very, very good. So they're eaten for the smoked fish, but actually they're also caught for caviar. So the roe, the eggs of the fish are made into what's called golden caviar, and it's a delicacy in Sweden. So an interesting fact is that most of the cisco that are caught in Lake Superior for the roe fishery or the egg fishery, most of that roe is actually shipped to Sweden as a delicacy, and you can buy it in Sweden. And I had the very bizarre experience of being in Sweden and being taken to a restaurant, and someone was like, "Oh, you have to have this. It's a delicacy here, and it's so, it's only here at this one time of year. It's really great. You have to have it." And I looked at the plate and I'm like, "I know what this is. I've had this all over me during spawning season before." It's cisco eggs. But people will still eat it here as well. Mostly up in Superior, Wisconsin and Minnesota. People ice fish for them as well. Down in the lower lakes, our population has been so low for so long that there's not really as much of a culture of ice fishing for them here, but we still do get a few people catching them through the ice.
Great. All right, so if you've got any more questions for Ellen about her research with the cisco in the Great Lakes, feel free to tweet her at her handle, which is Great Lakes Cisco. So yes, feel free if you're watching this on the replay to tweet her all your questions about it, and maybe she might share some cisco recipes that you know of or something. That would be great.
There are a few on my Twitter, so I'll have to retweet those.
For sure. Yeah. So, but stick around. We'll be broadcasting live again here real shortly as soon as I can get over to Ariel's poster on the other side of the what I'm calling the poster pit around here, because it's what it kind of feels like. So, but thank you for everyone for tuning in, and we'll be back live here in just a few more minutes. So stay tuned on Twitter for that link. And thanks you to everyone for tuning in today.